pleasure personally to welcome Peter Keller, who I've known Peter for a while through TGA. Oh my goodness, going back so many years. And now, Peter, I said you were at Vision Australia, but you're a Royal Victorian Eye and Ear Hospital. And Peter's going to talk about a view of apps as TGA regulate in trials. Peter most recently developed and implemented the GCP inspection program for the TGA, and he was working with Chrysalis, and he's an honorary principal fellow at the University of Melbourne, where he works in evidence-based practice and research translation for the Cochrane Centre for Evidence-Based Vision Care. So, Peter, great to have you online. Thanks a lot for sharing your experience and expertise, and over to you.
Thanks, Gordon. Can I just confirm you can hear me? Is that all right?
Yep. Yeah, all good. Yep. And we can see your slides.
All right, good. I traditionally have problems with my microphone, so I have to check that each time. So thanks for the introduction, and delighted to be part of this conference, and thanks for the introduction. Yes, have done a few things over a few years, which I think helps me bring to this workshop some expertise and some knowledge and some understanding that hopefully I can share with you. I will begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land I stand on today. I also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, any other Aboriginal people here today. When Gordon first approached me about speaking at this conference, and I looked at the session and noticed it was a workshop, and I thought, great, we're back onto in-person workshops, but alas, that's not the case. But nonetheless, we'll make the best of it that we can by video conference. I noticed that the session is called AI and social media, and the suggested topic was views of apps as TGA regulatable in trials, issues to consider. And I was thinking through about what I would talk about today. I had to ask myself, why are AI and social media of interest to this audience? And notice then that the previous presentation on social media, I think is very timely, given all of, or a large percentage of us and our interest then in the implementation of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework with hospital accreditation, in particular National Standard 2, the Partnering with Consumer Standard, and how that fits within those obligations, responsibilities. But also notice then that the next speaker will present on development guidelines for the review of AI projects by HREC. And I think there may also be Lara Palmer, I think, has a plenary session on the last day, which seems to be the same title. So AI. So, you know, I think social media is a hot topic, but AI is just this huge challenge, I think, that we're all confronted by, and increasingly so. And there's some language and some terminology, and not that I want to tie my my flag to the mast of this, but I think it's worth just covering off a couple of it. So, because it's used a little bit interchangeably and perhaps inconsistently, and probably by me as well. But my understanding is, and I'll use it as digital health is the term used for a broad range of health technologies, including mobile apps, wearable gadgets, and even AI. These technologies have the potential to transform the delivery of healthcare. And we see articles like this one in Forbes. And it reminded me then of when I was at the TGA, listening to John Skerritt, who was the Deputy Secretary at the time, speak, and I think it might have even been a Christmas review of the challenges facing the TGA. And it was clearly articulated that one of the key challenges to the international regulatory community is the emergence of software-based medical devices and how to regulate those. And interestingly enough, the TGA was the lead, or was chairing the international regulatory community task force in that regard. I'm going to talk fairly quickly because there's a lot to cover, but perhaps a little bit of levity to begin with. So if you're Gordon, our vintage, you think of AI, and I don't know about you, but I thought first of the seminal movie by Stanley Kubrick of Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: Space Odyssey with HAL, who is a sentient artificial general intelligence computer that controls the systems for the discovery. But I thought it was funny then that HAL was listed as the 13th greatest film villain in the American film industry's 100 years of 100 heroes and villains. So there is different views on where AI may help or hinder us. And so what is artificial intelligence? Look, I won't really go into this in any great detail, but it's computer software really to a certain degree. And but the important difference is that it mimics human cognitive abilities, such that it performs complex tasks that would typically be done by humans. So it makes decisions. So it's code on computer systems, and that is really where I will go with what I want to talk about today. There are distinctions then between automated machines, which simply follow instructions, but the other term perhaps just worth mentioning here is, and this is of real interest, I think, is what AI means and what machine learning actually means. And so machine learning then, as I understand it, is, and I think it's reasonable to say that it's a subset of AI that uses algorithms trained on data to produce models that perform such complex tasks. And you think about then research projects where you don't just want the software performing automated functions, but increasingly we are seeing AI with machine learning then learning on data sets to improve the decision making. So what I want to cover today, perhaps, which is the least exciting of the talks in this session, will be regulatory based, and I can hear the groans in the background, but I've reconfigured this. The important terms there are clinical trials, regulations, and software. And so the key words then drive us to what I'm going to cover. Specifically, software as it's regulated as a medical device. So medical software and mobile medical apps used in clinical trials may be regulated as medical devices and therefore may require exemption under the CTN or CTA schemes. And so this is, I think, what I want to cover to provide this audience with just some understanding of how clinical trials or the access to unapproved therapeutic goods are regulated, and what that means to clinical trials of unapproved therapeutic goods, and how some software is captured underneath that or within that, and in particular in Australia under the two schemes for exemption of entry to the ARTG, the CTN and CTA schemes. I should point out, just out of interest then, that this decision as to whether a CTN or CTA is required for a clinical trial is actually the responsibility of the trial sponsor. But interestingly, and it's noted in the guidance provided by the TGA, and the guidance, as our previous speaker had mentioned, hasn't always been fantastic from the TGA, and I think that's well understood and acknowledged. But the clinical trials handbook mentions then that the HREC that's responsible for reviewing the application is to be consulted on that decision by the trial sponsor as to whether the trial in question requires a CTN or a CTA. And I take this moment to mention then that that decision is not made, in fact, by the TGA, which might surprise a lot of you. So the really boring stuff, the regulation of therapeutic goods. And I think it's worthwhile, though, even though this is pretty dry stuff, it's worthwhile just going over it to set the scene more generally about the regulation of therapeutic goods, because in Australia, we have a very different legislative regulatory basis for the oversight, the regulation of clinical trials, and I'll use that as a general descriptor rather than a specific term, because unlike the US with the Code of Federal Regulations, which you may be aware of, or the EU with the Clinical Trials Regulation, which replaced the Clinical Trials Directive in early 2022, we do not regulate clinical trials in Australia. And there, Gordon, is your controversial or confronting question or statement. We, in fact, regulate therapeutic goods. So it's the TG Act and the TG Regs, both for therapeutic goods regulated as medicinal products, which includes some biologicals, and also the medical devices regs. So the TGA regulates medical devices in Australia, including, and in regulating medical devices is included software and mobile apps that meet the definition of a medical device. So if a software product is a medical device, it must be included in the ARTG, the Australian Register for Therapeutic Goods. And I hope everyone, and I'll show you at the end of this, perhaps what an ARTG public entry looks like. But someone within the administrative team supporting your HREC or your Research Government Office needs to know how to search the ARTG. And so it must be included unless it is exempt before it can be legally supplied in Australia. Exempt, there are various pathways for exemption to the Therapeutic Goods Act. One of them is under 19.1B1, I think, I'll have the reference there somewhere, is for solely use for experimental purposes. So the TGA also regulates in vitro diagnostic medical device software as a special subcategory. And we won't go into that because it's unnecessarily detailed and isn't the main picture that we want to cover here. So I've mentioned then that it needs to be on the meets the definition, needs to be exempt unless exempt, and let's keep rolling. So one of the simple things we have to start with is deciding whether a research proposal that's presented for consideration by either HREC or a Research Governance Office for authorisation does it fall within the regulatory framework? And funny enough, Nick Zepps and I have argued about this, and we have slightly different views, and it's not unreasonable to have slightly different approaches. But the way that I look at this, and I think works best, is to ask the very first question: does the project that's being proposed involve the use of unapproved therapeutic goods? If it's no, it's not regulated by the TGA. Well, I'll use the term not regulated, I mean by the TGA, because only some software is regulated by the TGA. Other software that's not regulated by the TGA may well be regulated under consumer law. So we're querying this, the proposal, or does it involve the use of unapproved therapeutic goods? You need to know what unapproved specifically means, and it means that it's not approved for the indication or the use included in the research proposal. So it can be approved for other intended purposes or uses, but it's not approved for that indication as the simplest description. If that is yes, then is the project actually a clinical trial? Because there are other pathways if it's not a clinical trial, and those include special access scheme, authorised prescriber, clinical trials pathways, and the fourth being then personal importation. So if it's yes and yes, then that research proposal really needs a CTN or a CTA. I mentioned here also, Gordon, you might like this one. I put an asterisk next to monitoring, and I use that to for a number of reasons. I won't even go into any depth, but we can talk about that in much greater depth at some other time, offline perhaps. But under the 12AD of the Therapeutic Good Regulations makes it a specific condition of the exemption under B, that the procedural protocol approved by the HREC that has the function of monitoring the conduct of the trial at each site sets out then that monitoring under the TGA Act and regulations is a shared function, at least partly the responsibility of the reviewing responsible HREC. I take the point, and it's well understood that under the national statement, it's clear that the approving authority or institution, in fact, is responsible for a significant and larger part of monitoring. Let me keep going because we're going to run out of time otherwise. So what are software-based medical devices? So they're medical devices that incorporate software or are software in themselves. And that includes a term that you'll hopefully become more familiar with by the end of this presentation, software as a medical device. There are also other categories, software that relies on particular hardware to function as intended, and those are regulated in Australia by the TGA. Software including mobile apps that is a medical device, if it fits within definition of a medical device, and again, here is a section 41BD of the Therapeutic Goods Act for the definition, unless otherwise excluded. And I just mentioned here that many mobile apps are simply sources of information or tools to manage a healthy lifestyle and are not then regulated by the TGA. Some examples of software or apps that are medical devices are listed, are described here, that tracks the person's health information, analyzes information to diagnose, provides risks, ratings of users, software that analyzes images, in this case, to screen for melanoma. There's some recent reforms that have taken place, and it has introduced a number of terms which are really important, and if nothing else that you come away from this presentation being at least slightly more familiar with are excluded products, and those are not medical devices, versus exempt software, which is a device but is not subject to all the regulatory requirements. We'll skip straight over clinical decision support software, and hopefully I have time at the end to show you an example of that. But these are the two terms. So exclusion means that the devices are completely unregulated by the TGA, is distinct from exemption. And when you work in the regulatory sphere, and I learned this quickly when I turned up at the TGA, who, like most of us from the outside looking in, you look at them and think, gee, they're pedantic on certain things, but there's a reason for it, and it struck me over the time that I spent working with the legal branch people in particular, is that you have to be absolutely correct in your use of terminology. So exclusion and exemption are not interchangeable, and they mean slightly different, and they do mean different things. So as I mentioned earlier, software as a medical device, it's software that functions and can function on a laptop, a smartphone, or a tablet, and it's the key term here is has an intended purpose consistent with the, not definite, the definition of medical device. So these are the intended purposes, so they're all fairly straightforward and I think fairly self-evident. Some software as a medical device may be an accessory to a medical device, and accessories are regulated as separate medical devices. There's some software that is a part of a medical device, so software in medical device. It's integral to the functioning of that device, and it is regulated as part of that device. And the examples here are embedded software or firmware. There's also software that controls a medical device, including mobile apps, can control or adjust medical device through connection, where it drives or influences a medical device. The software has the same classification as the medical device and is therefore within the regulatory scheme. An example of that type of software are pacemaker programmer controller, software for use on a laptop or PC, and the one of interest to me here at the INE Hospital is cochlear implant configuration optimization software for use on a laptop or a PC. So there are some key documents that you do, if you are faced with these questions, need to be able to go to, and I've cut and pasted. It's poor resolution, unfortunately. So I've the next few slides will actually deal with this in more in greater clarity. But there are, and I was saying, the guidance documents produced and provided by the TGA in this area, so software-based medical devices, is actually as good as what they do. And I'm delighted to see it, and I think it's actually very valuable to have and be able to refer to. And it steps you through, in this particular example, a schema, a flow diagram as to the questions to ask to decide whether is the software in the research proposal that's being considered regulated or not. So without going through the specifics, I've cut out these in order. So the first question is it regulated as a medical device? So is its purpose likely to be medical? So the intended purposes under the medical device regs, the intended purpose, like we saw on the earlier slide, covers all of those categories. And if it's not, then it's not a medical device. If it is, we go to the next slide along. So is its purpose likely to be medical? It's medical, yes. So then we go to the next one down. Is it excluded? That's excluded. Exempt questions. So does it have any of these functions? And there's a list of functions. If it's yes, it may be excluded. If no, it's not excluded. There are other regulatory instruments outside of the TG Act and the regulations, and included that are these excluded goods determinations, but you really don't need to know much about those. So we've gone through then, is it excluded? Yes. So it's not a medical device. If it's not excluded, how does it work? Does it work directly with data obtained in vitro? So no. Does it support clinical decisions? No. It could well be a medical device. So if it doesn't support clinical decisions, yes, it is an in vitro medical device and then is subject to regulation. Does it support clinical decisions? Yes. Is it the clinical decision software exempt? If it is the clinical decision support exempt? No. Is it device? If it is exempt, is an exempt medical device. So there's this whole schema, and it makes better sense in total, but there are questions you can step through. So the most, and I've subcategorized those by the purpose. Is it excluded? Is it exempt? And those questions, without providing you the examples, which are in the guidance, are fairly self-explanatory. So to finish with the exemption example, does the clinical decision support software meet all three criteria? And does it do this, this, and this? No, no, no. Or if it's yes to those, it's exempt. and to finish with, because I'm going to quickly run out of time, and I apologise for doing it very quickly. An example of this sort of thing is one that I've come across, and it is a poor example because it really is nothing more than what would be capable of a minimally competent healthcare professional. But it is an example of where things may well be heading. And it's the iIntelligence software, and it assesses, or it provides a clinical decision support probability of certain diagnoses based on the fundus photos provided. And I said I was going to quickly show you, it's not very clear, but you can go to and search the ARTG, and I did that for this, and it's probably not all that clear, but you can find then what the iIntelligence software has been, whether it's been entered in the ARTG, and it has been, and what the intended purpose is, which is down the bottom. So, Gordon, that's 12:30. I've spoken as quickly as I can, and there's a lot there for people to digest, and I suspect that any meaningful questions will be very difficult to answer in a short amount of time, but we'll be delighted for my details to be made available to attendees should they have specific questions that they want me to answer for them.
Thank you, Peter. You seem to have tried to deconvolute a very convoluted system where pretty much everything is captured as a medical device, it kind of appears. Nevertheless, there are obviously some differentiations, and we have had one good question from Dominic. Now, Dominic, if you want to ask this question yourself.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, Dominic, yep.
Yes, so our HREC is currently reviewing a study that is proposing to use a chatbot, and the chatbot is basically to deliver psychosocial education and interactive wellness tools to people with gambling problems. I'm just wondering if this would classify as a medical device.
So, without going through the schema, my advice typically is, and I should point out that the TGA does not provide advice, and that was made clear to me when I was there. So that used to frustrate the light of me. You can never get an answer out of the TGA to say, what does this mean? Can you tell me what I should do? But my advice to my colleagues, and certainly is, if in doubt, kick it out. So I think that if it is possible that it is a medical device and it's regulated as such, then it's best to proceed to continue under that position until proven otherwise. So what? And we had one which came to me out of interest, which was a research project that went to our HREC. And I looked at it and gone, I'm not really sure. So I went through exactly that schema and said, look, is this what's being proposed? Is the software, is it a medical device? Is the intended purpose to do this, this, and this? Is it excluded? Is it exempt? And if you follow it down to either a yes or no decision in the end, and that was similar to that iIntelligence model that I showed you, was a decision that yes, it was. So without giving you a non-answer, I'm not sure. I would need to step through that to make to be absolutely clear, and I'm happy to do so elsewhere.
And Peter, on that, Jan has pointed out, she's actually asked the question: is gambling a disease, or is it defined as such? And if it's not, or if it is, if it's in the is it the ICD-30, then maybe it's maybe it would be a medical device. But if it's not, then perhaps it wouldn't. And
so whether it's a disease or not probably doesn't determine whether it's a medical device. So that's just where you need to look at the intended purpose and the subcategories. Some of them are not. Yep. Sorry, look, there's too much there, but
yeah. And as Janelle points out, ever sensible Janelle, in my experience, it's worth getting a medtech regulatory specialist to advise on specific questions as to what regulation applies to different devices and software. So that was very sensible. Sanjeev said gambling is an addiction. is an addiction disorder. Okay. Right over, Peter, I think we'll stop there given the time. Thank you very much for trying to for actually enlightening us as to that. I think it's really useful to put these things in context, given what Duncan was talking about, and now given what Lucas.